On the first video, you should have read Nazism and its philosophy and the Nazi Creed and completed the questions and summaries as requested there. On this one, I'm going to go ahead and read through um, Mein Kampf and then look at the other two assignments and probably give you some helpful advice. I hope you take it, and I hope you do your best work. Let's go over Hitler's Mein Kampf. Um, as you should have learned from the slideshow a couple days ago, um, you should have learned that Mein Kampf was the name of Hitler's book, and it means my struggle. Let me read. Soon after he joined the obscure far not far far right wing National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler tried to use his gang of brown shirts to seize power in Munich. In German, you call it München. I know because I visited there, and I took it this place. It was very old, went back hundreds and hundreds of years, probably like the 1500s. These long benches, and you see the German dudes are wearing lederhosen, and the gals are wearing the German attire, and it's like very traditional, and they're carrying these big steins of beer. It's a whole scene. It was pretty cool. I think it was the Hofbrauhaus, I do believe. Anyway, but he tried to use his gang of brown shirts to seize power in Munich. The unsuccessful Putsch, which is a small-scale revolt that started in a Munich beer hall, sent Hitler to jail, really to prison for about a year or so, a year or two. There he wrote a long political essay describing his philosophy of a master race. He really got a slap on the wrist, and he comes back with more supporters because then he claims to be a martyr after this. His belief that the Jews were responsible for Germany's problems, his visionary goals for himself, the Nazis and New German Reich or Empire. The book was titled Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It was published in 1925 and later in 1927. And this Hitler excerpt, Hitler's going to discuss the use of propaganda. All right, let's speed ahead to the questions. Answer quick. Okay, so the first thing we're looking for is his recommended camp propaganda technique, and you got to make sure you write a complete sentence. According to Hitler, was ineffective about German propaganda. It's probably going to refer to World War I, I'm guessing. In contrast, what was effective about Allied propaganda? All right, they did something better than the Germans. And he's trying to get them to learn. Why must propaganda be completely one-sided? In your opinion, do Hitler's ideas about propaganda apply today in advertising and political campaigning? If so, how? Okay, so here's what you want to do. I just want to warn you in the first place. First, this is going to be very poorly written because Hitler wasn't a good writer. He's a high school dropout, so he never mastered writing. So if you think it's hard to read, it is harder to read, and that's why I'm creating this video to help you. The more difficult something is to read, the more you should take it in small chunks. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to read a chunk and then see if we can answer questions, and then a chunk and an answer. And I'm going to try to highlight things I think are important as I read. I'm going to just use light blue for this section because I used yellow and pink earlier. When I use different colors, it helps my brain. And if I ever go back and look, I can usually spot things a little quicker. All right, so let's read 4 paragraphs and move on. Looks like they got short paragraphs, and it's about a page and a half long. Ever since I have been scrutinizing political events, I have taken a tremendous interest in propagandist activity. Note the I in this case is Hitler. This is his biography, and so it's written from his perspective. Okay, continuing. I saw that the socialist Marxist organizations mastered and applied this instrument with astounding skill. He's talking about the communists. And I soon realized that the correct use of propaganda is a true art which has remained practically unknown to the bourgeois parties, middle class, upper class, conservatives, what have you. But it was not until the war, World War One, is his reference here, that it became evident what immense results could be obtained by a correct application of propaganda. What we failed to do, the enemy did with amazing skill and really brilliant calculation. I myself learned enormously from this enemy war propaganda. Is propaganda a means or an end? It is a means, so it's a tool, and the goal is, I don't know, getting support, and therefore be judged with regard to its end. It must consequently take a form calculated to support the aim which it serves. To whom should propaganda be addressed? to the scientifically trained intelligentsia or to the less educated masses. Must be addressed always and exclusively to the masses. So propaganda is for the big bulk of people, not the brainiacs. So, first part, Hitler recommends always targeting masses with propaganda. Another chunk. With the intelligentsia, if that's too big for you, feel free to make it smaller. I like it nice and big when I'm reading. And that's a benefit because I never run out of screen. I can always scroll. But the intelligentsia, or those who today unfortunately often go by that name, what they need is not propaganda but scientific instruction. So you need to give smart people evidence. Yeah, duh. But the masses, you don't need evidence because the masses. And he's gonna really describe the bulk of people in pretty unflattering terms here. The content of propaganda is not science any more than the object represented in a poster is art. In other words, it doesn't have to be literal, just like art doesn't have to be literal. Okay, the art of the poster lies in the designer's ability to attract the attention of the crowd by form and color. So again, just like art, the propaganda's effectiveness is in popularity, not in truth. The function of propaganda does not lie in the scientific training of the individual, and calling the masses' attention to certain facts, processes, necessities, etc., whose significance is thus, for the first time, placed within their field of vision. The whole art consists in doing this skillfully, that everyone will be convinced that the fact is real, the process necessary, necessity correct, etc. Propaganda's effect, for the most part, must be aimed at the emotions, only to a very limited degree the so-called intellect. Let's pause there and see what we can answer. With appeals to emotion. And I would just cut it off right there. And I would get rid of this because, again, I'm going to try to make it neat. That looks pretty good to me. By going to emotions. So let's look again for some more specifics on ineffective German propaganda and effective Allied propaganda. Let's see if we come back to that. Okay, I think that's going to get to here. All right, let's read these paragraphs. All propaganda must be popular, and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its purely intellectual will have to be. Okay, so it needs to be not too, it needs to be basic. Otherwise, people won't understand. In other words, he's saying people are too stupid, so don't make it too complicated. Yeah, he didn't really think a lot of people. Here, you see it. Receptive, if you can, translate his poorly written messages. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small. Does that mean they're stupid? But their power of forgetting is enormous. Not only stupid, they're forgetful. So they're dumb and forgetful. Dumb and forgetful. I'm going to write that down. Got it. By the way, this was published. Everyone knew he wrote this and he thought this, and yet he kept trying to manipulate people. In consequence, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points because, again, people are dumb, right? And must harp on these and slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want them to understand by your slogan. In other words, you need repetition. And slogans are short, remember? Very few. It's got to be short and it's got to be repeated a lot. For instance, it was absolutely wrong to make the enemy ridiculous, as the Austrian and German comic papers did. Okay. So you can't make them ridiculous. It was absolutely wrong because actual contact with an enemy soldier was bound to arouse an entirely different conviction, and the results were devastating, for now the German soldier felt himself swindled. So if you make the enemy ridiculous, then you're going to look like you're trying to trick. When you try to trick people, you lose your credibility. Okay, that makes sense. By his propaganda, the desire to fight or even stand firm was not strengthened, but the opposite occurred. His courage flagged because he realized he couldn't trust his government, and maybe these people are not as bad as they said. Flag is to weaken. All right, let's move forward. Okay. What was effective German propaganda? Was that showed allies as ridiculous and once the Germans saw that the allied soldiers not ridiculous, they lost confidence in government military. That's what's being said. It's felt ridiculous. So when you get a little squirrely line, that means you misspelled something. It's good to fix that. And now it looks nice. See what I did? I always make it look nice. I go back to the reading and I keep going. Left off at courage flagged. By contrast, the war propaganda of the English and Americans was psychologically sound. Psychologically sound. So instead of ridiculous, you showed them as barbarians. The Germans, by representing Germans' own people as barbarians, and the Huns, they prepared the individual soul for the terrors of war. Germans to their people as barbarian Huns, they prepared individual for the terrors of war. By the way, you want to get rid of that space, you just double click on it like I did. The Huns, they prepared the individual for the terrors of war, and thus helped to preserve him from disappointments, reinforce his faith. So what the Allies did well was they developed trust by showing them as barbarians and what they can expect about war being awful, because in war, people do act barbaric. Reinforce his faith in the truth of his government's assertion. On the other hand, it increased his rage and hatred against the vile enemy. By showing them as barbarians, it's easier to hate. Okay? And so the English soldier can never feel that he had been misinformed by his own countrymen. Okay, so let's go. What was effective? See what I'm doing here? Chunk, answer, chunk, answer. That's how you read effectively, especially when it's more difficult. Allied propaganda was showed Germans and Huns as barbarians and prepared soldiers for the awful truths of war. Everyone really vicious. I'm really saying. Okay. Creating trust with continuing. Okay. It was absolutely wrong for the German government to discuss war guilt from the standpoint that Germany alone can't be held responsible for the outbreak of the catastrophe would have been correct to load every bit of the blame of the shoulders on the enemy. In other words, by taking some blame ourselves, we hurt our own cause. But if everyone did that, it would have been more honest. As soon as our propaganda admits so much as a glimmer of right on the other side, the foundation for doubt in our own right has been laid. We can't have a glimmer of right on the other side. Otherwise, we're creating an argument against ourselves. The masses are then in no position to distinguish where foreign injustice ends and our own begins. In other words, they'll think we misled them and the enemy has misled them. So both of them, they're just going to get confused. English propagandists understood all this most brilliantly and acted accordingly. They made no half statements that might have given rise to doubts. The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly with unflagging contention. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over and over again. In other words, repetition, basics, appeal to the masses, no doubt. So what does he say? Propaganda must be completely one-sided. To avoid casting doubt on. I think I'm going to make these all 10 points each. Because this was a tough read. I spent a lot of time to avoid casting doubt on your own position. In your opinion, do Hitler's ideas about propaganda apply today in advertising and political campaigning? If so, how? Yeah, well, when people argue today, they never give the other side any credit. So, to that extent, I would say it's true, even though the other arguments usually are not so bad as you might see on TV, especially when you hear a politician being over the top in their positions, especially when the positions are really not that different. Go ahead and write the fifth one in a complete sentence, and then continue on this video. Yeah, so I just decided to make it worth 10 more points each. So that's another 20 points. Let me do that on the original doc. I'm still thinking of it. It's going to push this over 150 altogether. Okay. Let's go to the next part of this. Hitler versus Stalin review. Read each statement by letter. Identify if the statement is true for Hitler, Stalin, or both. Choose both. Explain why the statement applies to each person. Okay, here's what I know is true. Hitler was way on the right. It was about the state of the individual. It was about using terror, propaganda to support his goals. Stalin, way on the left. Communism is like the exact opposite of fascism. Um, so they wanted to have the power of economics in the hands of the people, theoretically. But they also use propaganda, violence, charisma to benefit their people. I'm just going to look through it, and I'll tell you how many times each letter comes up based on my calculations. I'm not going to tell you which one's right or not. Okay, just quickly going over the assignment. I thought it was both 5 times, and either Hitler or Stalin the other 3 times. So you should have B chosen 5 times, and that means you should have to explain why. You don't have to go in great detail, but if you're saying this first part, Hitler had the concentration camps, Stalin had the gulag, that works. Of course, one should be B. All right, moving on. This next part is a propaganda poster. I would encourage you to do it. I'm not going to help you with it. Read it carefully. Do your best to figure it out. That tool right there is a hammer that a blacksmith would use. Um, Hitler was not a frontline soldier. That much I'll tell you. Hitler during World War One, he wanted to have this image as a great soldier, but he was in the messenger. He would be the person in charge of getting message from one person to another. So he wasn't really a frontline soldier, despite what this looks like. And that again shows this is propaganda. I would encourage you to do this though, and then submit the entire document by end of business on this class day. You can finish it for homework if you need to, but do finish.